Okay, here we go. Video 10 of the Unit 2 Population and Migration series. This is the second of the 4 migration videos to go along with the slides. And today we're going to be talking about both immigration with an E and immigration with an I. Remember that the word migration is different from the word movement. Yesterday we were talking about cyclic movement, periodic movement. When it's migration, it involves the long-term relocation. So generally speaking, when people make a migration, the intention is to stay long-term in the new destination. When it's spelled with an E, immigration, it means that you're leaving your country of origin. And then when it's spelled with an I, immigration, it means that you've arrived into your destination. So both of these statistics will be important when we count population. For the most part, we've kind of ignored migration so far because we wanted to concentrate on birth rates, death rates, rate of increase, doubling time, fertility, all of those kinds of statistics. But we do need to understand that immigration can play a role in the population statistics of both the sending country and as well as the receiving country. We also know that there is this phenomenon known as internal migration. Sometimes that's called domestic migration. Domestic, of course, means at home. There was a question on a recent AP Human Geography exam where the question was it was a map, a stimulus, and it was talking about domestic migration, and a lot of students were writing about Mexicans coming to America. That's not domestic migration, that's international migration. So we have to be very careful about the vocabulary, and that's why it's important that you watch these slides and you understand what all the words mean. We also remember that when we did the true map false impression work in class on the Chromebooks, I told you guys about, the first question was, where do African Americans live in the United States? And while the legacy of slavery is that there's a large black population in the South, there's also a very large population of African Americans in cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, which is, of course, a result of what we call the Great Migration. Post-emancipation, particularly after the First World War, you saw a big exodus of black Americans leaving the South as the push factor of escaping the segregation and the Jim Crow laws, and the pull factor being that they were looking for work in big northern cities, especially in the factories. So make sure you remember your pushes and pulls, and make sure you know, of course, all your vocab. So these lines here represent the flow lines of some of the biggest migration streams that are currently happening in the world. And I'll go through them very quickly, just kind of from west back towards the east. This one, of course, is from Latin America up through Central America, through Mexico, the conduit into the United States. And this one, of course, has been in the news quite a lot lately. From West Africa and from Eastern Africa up through the Sahara, across the Mediterranean and into Europe. You'll see this a lot on the news as well, where young people are trying to leave Africa for economic reasons, heading across the Mediterranean and going into Italy, Spain, as well as up through the Balkan Peninsula. We will do a geo-inquiry on this in class next week. Also, remember guest workers coming from India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia, coming over to the Middle East, trying to get jobs in the oil-rich countries of the Middle Eastern states. So these are all very common migration routes. And if you look at this map, you're going to see that you've got the shading. This is a choropleth map showing you the origins of the people who have come to the United States. Because in the United States, we have almost 50 million people who were foreign born. Some of you are children of people who have come to the United States. Mrs. Turner is the child of Cubans who came to the United States back in the 1960s. So a lot of this is, of course, China, India, Vietnam, the Philippines. There are geopolitical reasons for this. After the Vietnam War, a big number of Vietnamese people coming to the United States. China and India, massive populations. That's always a push factor. United States, of course, remember, used to own the Philippines until 1947. So there's a connection between the Philippines and the United States. Obviously, Cubans into South Florida, Dominicans going to New York City, Mexicans coming into the United States, Texas and California, two big destinations for them. Notice that the countries that are darker here tend to be bigger populations, or they have some sort of relative location connection to the United States. So, what are these human migrations in modern times? You can see here that we've got several ones coming out of Europe, and those are the ones that are, I think that's purple, don't make fun of my disability, but the purple ones would be, again, the European colonizers coming to the New World, the English, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and moving to not only the United States, but also into the Caribbean and into South America. Later on, you would see that that also went to Africa and even over into Australasia. So that's the one big stream that comes out of there. Number 1, 2, 3, all of those kind of fitting that same trend. 4 represents your African slave trade. 5 is going to be the leaving of Hindu guest workers and indentured servants, primarily from India, into British possessions in East Africa, South Africa. A lot of people don't know that Gandhi actually got his start as a lawyer in South Africa, in the city of Durban, before he went back to India to lead the independence movement. So you can see that anywhere there's a big British population, there should be an Indian movement pattern coming out of the subcontinent, and you'll create that diaspora. From China, number 6, and this is where I'm going to zoom in on the next map. The number 6 trend here is basically just highlighted on this map here, going into places like Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore. There's 1/3 of Singapore's population is ethnically Chinese. So that's number 6. And then, of course, you see 7 and 8. These are interesting because these are domestic internal migration patterns. The southward and westward movement of Americans, and in Russia, the movement out of European Russia into the Soviet sphere of Asian Russia. So across into the stands. 40% of Kazakhstan's population is ethnically Russian, moving out with the Trans-Siberian Railroad out towards the Pacific Ocean, towards the Kamchatka Peninsula, and out towards the city of Vladivostok. So all of these are great migration streams, and it would be a good idea if you know who these people are, why they were moving, where they were moving from, where they were going to, and remember the where and the why there, the patterns and the processes. So this is just a simple map that shows net migration. Net migration is the difference between the number coming in and the number who are going out. So immigration with an I and immigration with an E. If the country is red, that means that it's a net gainer. And so what that means is obviously more people moving in than there are people moving out. Both the United States and Canada are historically big receivers of migrants. By far, the United States takes in the most, but again, we're 329 million people. We can take in a bigger number. Canada is only 30 million people. They take in a bigger percentage than we do, but by no means anywhere close to the number of migrants that we absorb from other parts of the world. Obviously, you can see Australia, also a long history of migration in. Another place that would be interesting for you to look at is in here in the Middle East. A lot of the guest workers, remember we talk about this phenomenon of guest workers, young men especially coming from South and Southeast Asia and moving into Saudi Arabia. One interesting factor about that is that many of the men who make this migration for work reasons are already Muslims themselves. So for some people in the Middle East, they're more tolerant of these guest workers in the sense that culturally there's more of a buy-in to the Islamic culture that is present in the Middle East. So this is just a map showing the Great Migration, which I talked about earlier in the slides. And this is the movement of African Americans out of the Deep South and northeast, following at that time, mostly trains that went up into the northeastern big cities like Baltimore and big cities up into Boston and Buffalo, New York. Again, a lot of big factory towns up there. Most of the time, it was the Atlantic states that followed that pattern. From Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, generally they would go up through the Midwest, across the Ohio River. Cincinnati was a huge kind of a transit city for the Great Migration, and then moving into places, for example, Detroit and Chicago, as we talked about before. From the trans-Mississippi part of the South, you saw mostly a movement pattern out to the west. And this is where we get the big black populations today in cities like Los Angeles and even particularly in Oakland. So this is something, again, that's never been on the AEP exam as an essay question, and I think this would be a phenomenal topic that they could pick to talk about migration patterns and processes. So remember that when we talk about migration, a lot of this is perception. People make a move, and you got to remember, everyone moves and they think it's going to be better when they get to their destination. Nobody ever moves and thinks it's going to be worse. You wouldn't make the move. So generally speaking, the push and pull factors have to be balanced to where people are saying, I'm going to move because I think I'm going to have a better life, whether that's economic, social, cultural, political, or environmental. So remember that distance is something that we can calculate in miles, but also distance can be relative. It's the perception of how far it is. And remember that when you make a move, particularly the longer the move is, there are intervening opportunities or intervening obstacles that get in the way, and sometimes you might not even ever complete the move that you thought you were going to do. Sometimes your move is shortened because of these. Ravenstein was a geographer that talked about migration rules, and here are several of the bigger ones. The idea that net migration is a fraction of the gross migration between two places. So for every move, there's going to be some number of people who go back the other direction. That could even be people who are deported and sent back home. Or it could be people who get to a new destination and then there's a family illness that forces them back. Or they run out of money. Or they find out that they didn't like it as much as they thought they would. The majority of migrants, they move very short distances because it's cheaper and easier, and they know more about the destination they're going to. If people do go long distances, they usually end up in a big city like New York or London. Urban residents are always less migratory than rural. And one of the big patterns you're going to see in the world is that a lot of migration is rural to urban. And then remember also that young men are much more likely to move than anybody with children, especially single women. There is still a gender imbalance in that sense. Men are more likely to move than women living on their own. So this is going to lead us to this idea of the gravity model. And the gravity model is basically what you do even in a science class. It's the mass of the first object multiplied by the mass of the second object divided by the distance squared between them. In this case, it's not planets or objects in space, it's two countries. And so we would take the population of the first country, the population of the second country, and then divide by the distance squared between them. So two countries that have lots of people and are closer together are going to have more migration than two countries with less people who are farther apart. And again, that's kind of AP common sense, a little bit of a Toblerism. Everything's related to everything else, but near things are way more related than distant things. Wilbur Zielinski, a geographer who sadly just died recently, was very famous for this idea of the gravity model and the idea that countries that were in stages 2 and 3, where the economies are improving, but the populations are exploding because birth rates are high and death rates are low, these are always the source areas of these countries, of these migrations. So if you go back earlier in the slides, when I showed you that map that showed the source area, Mexico, India, China, these are excellent opportunities to understand this principle, Zielinski's idea. Countries that have large youthful populations, that's always going to be a country that has a large number of immigrants with an E. And the countries that are older, that are richer, are always going to be places that people want to go to. And so the immigration with an I is going to be higher in places like the US and Canada, Australia, European countries, because these youthful people from the less developed countries are seeking better opportunities in those places. This is simply just an illustration of that gravity model. Again, two places that are bigger are going to have more migration between them than two places that are smaller. And also there'll be more migration between places that are closer together than there will be between places that are farther apart. What are these catalysts of migration? Again, ESPN, economic things, social cultural things, political things, environmental things. We can even talk about chain migration, which is very social, where one person moves and then they begin to bring their family and their friends along with them. A lot of times this is dependent on the flow of remittances. There has to be a kinship link for chain migration to happen. So you're moving following your cousin or your brother-in-law or your parents or your children and grandchildren. And this is very common, especially from Latin America into the United States, to see this chain migration. Pushes and pulls, we've talked about them a little bit. The conditions that cause people to leave are called pushes, and the conditions that attract you from far away are generally called pulls. In reality, there's a little bit of both all the time. And we've talked about some of those. We'll certainly look at that when you do the migration work in your Chromebook. And then finally, just a couple of examples of pushes and pulls so that you can see it. In Florida, for example, a lot of people come to Florida because of the weather. They're tired of living up north where it's cold. They want to be in Florida when it's 75 degrees in January. So these are just really good things for you to look at as a checklist so that you understand pushes and pulls. Okay, that'll do it. We'll talk again soon for video number 11.